I think if you are now a partner of Russia, in most cases, if you get into trouble, you can count on supportive words from Moscow, but not much else.
Hello and welcome to Independent Media. I'm Kartul Sharashenidze. Joining me today is former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Steven Pifer. We are discussing the implications of the U.S. operation in Iran for Russia, Ukraine, and the broader geopolitical landscape. Ambassador Pifer, first of all, thank you so much for your time for joining us today. Ambassador, Russia and Iran signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement last year, right? So Moscow has condemned the U.S. operation in Iran. What do you make of Russia's reaction, and what would you expect from Russia under this partnership with Iran?
Yes, well, the Russian reaction to the American and Israeli strikes that are taking place now is very similar to the Russian reaction when the United States attacked Iranian nuclear facilities back in June of 2025, and very similar to when the American forces seized the leader of Venezuela, Maduro's. As there are expressions of solidarity with Iran, there are condemnation of the United States, but Russia really doesn't do anything. And I think what you're seeing is that because Russia now, having been bogged down for more than 4 years since they launched the major invasion of Ukraine, the Russians don't have much appetite, and they certainly have limited ability to project power far beyond their borders.
You already mentioned Venezuela, and at the beginning of this year, we saw the U.S. operation in Venezuela, and now the strikes against Iran. So what these developments suggest about the state of Russia's global partnerships today?
Well, I think if you are now a partner of Russia, in most cases, if you get into trouble, you can count on supportive words from Moscow, but not much else.
Iran has been one of the key supporters of Russia's war in Ukraine, right? And Russian forces have used Iranian Shahed drones extensively. So what implications could the current developments in Iran have for Russia's war effort in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that there are probably three implications. One is, of course, there's a lot of focus, particularly in Washington, D.C. now on Iran. That means less attention for the Russia-Ukraine war. I think a second implication is that you have seen oil prices increase, and that will be very much welcomed in Russia because the Russian oil revenues in December and January were at historically low levels. So they'll see that oil price gain as providing greater revenues for the Russian budget. And I think the third implication is that for the kind of air defense interceptors that Ukraine needs, particularly to intercept Russian ballistic missiles, there's now greater demand on those assets for use in the Persian Gulf region. So I think there are some implications that may make things difficult or a bit more difficult for the Ukrainian side in the near term.
You did not mention the ongoing peace talks. How might the developments in Iran influence the diplomatic dynamics between the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine?
Well, again, since I think the peace talks, on the American side, really the person who's deciding this is President Trump. And to the extent that he's focused more on the Persian Gulf and Iran, he's less focused on Russia-Ukraine. Although I'm not sure in a practical sense if it really has much impact, because I don't think that the negotiations that have been mediated by the Americans are really bringing us closer to an end of the Russia-Ukraine war. And I think the fault really lies with Mr. Trump, is he has failed to back his diplomacy with pressure on the recalcitrant party in these negotiations. Look over the past year, I think you have seen significant suggestions by the Ukrainians that they are prepared to be flexible and even make what will be very painful decisions with regards to accepting some Russian de facto occupation of Ukrainian territory. You have seen no reciprocal, no matching movement by the Russian side. And my own conclusion is that the Russians really because Putin still believes he can achieve his goals on the battlefield, they're not negotiating seriously. They want to give an appearance of negotiating so that they can string Mr. Trump along and prevent him from imposing new sanctions on Russia. But the reality is that until and unless Mr. Trump takes a tougher view and puts greater pressure on Moscow, the negotiating effort, I think, is going to fail. And that will be Mr. Trump's failure.
Ambassador, you mentioned that the United States and its partners are using some of the same air defense systems in conflict with Iran that Ukraine relies on. So what does this mean for Ukraine in the coming weeks and months as it continues to defend itself against Russia?
Well, I think perhaps the most critical need that Ukraine has from the United States right now is Patriot interceptors to intercept Russian ballistic missiles. And there is now a greater demand in the Gulf region by both American forces, but also American partners in the Middle East for those missiles. So I think that pressure may result, it will make it harder for Ukraine to receive more Patriot missiles. Now, I would note, I think that the Ukrainians here, I think, do have an asset that they could offer to the United States and other partners in the Persian Gulf, which is that the Ukrainians have developed a huge amount of expertise at intercepting these Iranian Shahed-type drones. And I think they've come up with much more cost-effective ways of intercepting those drones than right now are being used in the Persian Gulf. So to the extent that Ukraine has the possibility, because of course Ukraine has to use those first and foremost to defend its own airspace, but if Ukraine can provide some of that to help out in the Persian Gulf, I think that would be very beneficial for the United States and for other Persian Gulf countries.
What implications could these developments have for Iran's neighbors in the South Caucasus?
Well, I guess the only thing is I think this morning there was reports that a couple of Iranian drones had struck targets inside Azerbaijan. And it seems that part of the Iranian strategy is to attack a lot of neighboring states to try to somehow pull them in the war. It's a calculation that Iran makes that, I assume they conclude it will be to their benefit. I'm not sure I personally understand the logic, because it seems to me that the more neighbors Iran attacks, the greater risk it finds itself fighting not just the United States and Israel, but also its neighbors.
Let me ask you about China, with possible meeting between President Trump and President Xi in the near future. So what these developments in Iran mean for U.S.-China relations and the context of that meeting?
Well, I think what you're seeing right now is, again, China, like Russia, has been expressing some verbal support and some criticism of the American military action, but China's not really doing anything. So at this point, and I think the Chinese also have an additional concern, which is about 40% of the oil that comes out of the Persian Gulf goes to China. And I suspect that the Chinese are concerned that if Iran does succeed in either shutting down the Strait of Hormuz or targeting a significant number of tankers so that tankers stop going, at some point down the road, that could have an impact on China's energy situation. So I think that's the Chinese concern now. But I'm not sure that the Chinese can play much of a role to try to facilitate a solution between Iran on the one hand and the United States and Israel on the other.
Well, Ambassador, this is my very last question. Like, looking at the bigger picture, how might the development around Iran reshape the broader geopolitical landscape?
I think it's very difficult to tell at this point. We don't know how this war between the United States and Israel and Iran will play out. And part of the confusion is that I don't think the administration has yet defined for itself what its clear objective is. We've heard multiple objectives expressed over the last 6 days. They include ending Iran's nuclear program. The president last summer said he had obliterated that program already. We've seen them talking about concern about Iranian ballistic missiles and concern about that Iran might have an intercontinental ballistic missile or be developing one. There's no evidence that I've seen to suggest that Iran is close to a missile that could reach the United States. And then there's also been some talk, and if you look at the campaign going after Iranian leaders, that it's about regime change. And the specific goal that, in fact, is driving the American participation in this war is going to have a big impact on how long this war continues. And again, I think the administration thus far has put a lot of goals out there, but there's confusing and there's contradictions, and it's not totally clear exactly what the administration wants to achieve. And the more ambitious their goals are, the longer this could drag on. I mean, if they are serious about regime change, I think if you look back over the last 85, 90 years, there's no case where air power alone succeeded in changing a regime. And even when you put ground forces there, I think in the American case, since World War II, you could claim success in Panama. But in every other case where there was a goal of regime change, even ground forces failed to do that. And my guess is that Mr. Trump very much does not want to put American troops on the ground into Iran.
Well, the administration says this is not a war and not a so-called regime change war.
Yeah, well, right now it's a war of choice. Now, it's interesting. I mean, Republicans in Congress don't want to call it a war. But if you look at, in the last 2 days, President Trump has called it a war. Secretary of Defense Hegseth has called it a war. It's a silly semantic argument. And I think it's being used in part by Republicans because, one, they don't want to oppose Trump and vote against a war powers resolution. But on the other hand, they don't want to have a vote on a War Powers Resolution Act because they don't want to be seen as voting for this in case the war goes bad. They don't want to vote now to authorize Mr. Trump to carry out military action. And then, in the fall, just before elections, if America's still bogged down in that war, they don't want to have the fact that they voted to support it working against them. This, I think, is quite frankly, it's an act of cowardice. The Constitution provides that this should be a decision by the American Congress, and the Republicans are not prepared to carry out their their constitutional responsibility.
Well, thank you so much again for your time, Ambassador Pifer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.